Every little thing you think that you need. Every little thing you think that you need. Every little thing that's just feeding your greed. Oh, I bet that you'd be fine without it.
You're listening to the Minimalists Podcast with Joshua Fields Milburn and TK Coleman.
Thank you, Alabama. Hello, everybody. Today we are joined by Colin Wright. Colin is the man who introduced Nicodemus and me to minimalism way back in 2009. He is the author of 40 books, including his brand new book, How to Turn 39, Thoughts About Aging for People of All Ages. He's also the host of two of my favorite podcasts, Brain Lenses and Let's Know Things. Coming up on this free public minimal episode, a caller has a question about the ugly pressure that our culture puts on women to look youthful, as if aging is bad or evil. And then we've got a lightning round question about whether your 15-year-old self would be impressed by your current self. That's followed by our Right Here, Right Now segment. Spoiler alert, it's my birthday, and I demand a birthday gift from you. And then we've got a listener tip for you as well. You can check out the full Maximal edition of episode 448. That's the full episode where we answer 5 times the questions and we dive deep into several simple living segments. That private podcast episode is out right now at patreon.com/theminimalists. Your support keeps our podcast 100% advertisement free because sing along at home, y'all. Advertisements suck. Let's start with our callers. If you have a question or a comment for our show, we'd love to hear from you. Give us a call. Our phone number is 406-219-7839, or just email a voice memo right from your phone to podcast@theminimalists.com. Our first question today is from McKenna.
Howdy, Minimalists. My name is McKenna, and I'm calling from Calgary, Alberta, Canada. I've been listening to your podcast since I was 16 years old, and now I'm almost 22. I want to thank you for introducing me to the world of minimalism and helping me embrace simplicity in some of my most formative years. I'm also a Patreon subscriber. There's a pressure on women to maintain youthful skin, free of wrinkles, sagging, and other natural signs of aging. I think this topic becomes especially interesting given that Botox and fillers are becoming more accessible and are no longer just for celebrities. My question for you is this: how do we learn to embrace the natural aging process when there is such a societal pressure that encourages us to spend hundreds on fillers, Botox, and anti-aging products in the name of looking youthful? How can we learn to flip the narrative and embrace aging? Thanks for all that you do, and I look forward to hearing your thoughts on this.
Now, Colin, you start your new book, How to Turn 39. It's really a book about aging for all ages, but you talk about what aging is. So what does it mean for McKenna or anyone else who's listening to this to embrace the natural aging process? Because it's wild to hear, like, I'm 22 years old and I really feel like I'm aging out of my youth at this point.
I think that there are good arguments to be made for trying to stay healthy. And I think a lot of the things that we associate with youth is healthfulness, because at a certain point, what we consider to be aging and middle age and stuff, that's actually just the physical manifestation of our bodies entering a different stage of life. And that's okay. That's natural. It's also natural to a certain degree within a culture that romanticizes and sexualizes youth to look at that and say, that is beauty, that is appeal, that is what makes me worth something. And then to try to do what you can to line up with that. That's what we do with anything that culture tells us is good and correct. We latently, unless we really think hard about it and decide to do something differently, we try to align with that current. I think it is very useful to take a step back and recognize that there are different types of value, different types of appeal, different types of sexuality, different types of aesthetics that we can appreciate, not just those directly associated with youth. And I don't think that there's anything inherently wrong with moisturizing and applying sunscreen and dyeing our hair and getting injections if you choose to do that. If that's something that you really feel allows you to reflect what's inside, outside, I think do it. There's a lot of good arguments for that. There's a lot of confidence value. There's a lot of value in you feeling more like yourself, physically as well as psychologically and mentally. I think a lot of people who do it are not necessarily doing it for that reason. I think there's a lot of marketing messages out there trying to convince us that we have to do it. And I think it is a very good idea to take the time, whatever age you are, to recognize that there are different ways to age. There are different ways to look attractive and appealing, to be valuable, to be worthwhile and worthy. And if you can do that work first before making that decision to do anything permanent, to do anything surgical, but then also injections and expensive creams and anything else that you might feel like you have to buy, do that inner work first, and then you'll probably make better decisions about the external applications that you do related to that.
One thing that helps with that tremendously is just expanding your vocabulary of like what it means to grow as a human being. So for me, when I first entered my 30s, I really felt like a loser and I struggled with this greatly. And when I got to the bottom of it, I realized that all of my heroes were professional athletes and entertainers, people who peak around the age of 31, 32, 33. And in popular culture, their legacies are sealed, right? So if you play in the NBA or the major leagues or you're a rapper, by the time you're 32, 33, that's it. Your career's over and we're having debates as to whether or not you're the greatest of all time. And so when you turn 32, 33 and all your heroes are like that, and then you continue to watch these things and now all of the people that are really good are 5, 10 years younger than you, you start to feel really old and really behind. But then when you expand and you start to study history, you start to look outside of pop culture and you take control over your own input, you realize, wow, there really is something to this idea that life doesn't begin until you're 40 because there are so many cool people that are 50, 60, 70 in so many interesting ways. They're just not glorified by the marketing, as you say.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
Colin, I would also say there's something to piggyback on what TK is saying. There's something about we dismiss older people in our culture. Now, not all cultures do this, obviously. And so you don't want to be dismissed and therefore you want to be youthful as a result.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. And, part of it is because that sells. It's very easy to sell youthful appeal because youth is associated with so many other things that we biologically crave, but then also, again, culturally throughout all of history, that has been a valuable thing to trade upon, has been youth and everything associated with youth.
And especially for women, we see it in this culture where the youngest woman, 19 to 25, is like, this is what is the ideal woman in a lot of movies, certainly magazines, but especially in advertisements.
Yeah. And we reinforce this in so many ways too. It's part of what sells. Something that I was surprised to find actually when I was doing research for the book is that a lot of our, throughout all cultures, a lot of our most meaningful milestones and celebrations are also associated with youth. The things, quinceañeras, and we have these celebrations as we're young because they're associated with fertility, traditionally, historically. Wow. When we move out of the fertile period, though, in biological ways, but then also like cultural ways, there are not a lot of celebrations that continue till today that celebrate the transition to that next stage, whatever that stage even is. Like, it's very difficult. We don't have a good vocabulary to describe what is it when you're done with having kids, when you're done with raising kids, when you're done with maybe working in a money-earning sense. We've got retirement, but that's an economic term. Mm-hmm. Like, we don't have cultural terms. And there's very, very few cultures that have done this and maintained this. And the ones that have historically have had ceremonies to represent moving on from the stage of where you maybe had kids, maybe raised kids. Now the kids are off having their own kids. What are you doing now? Well, you are ascending to the role of elder. You are becoming a distributor of wisdom, somebody who has accumulated a lot of experience and knowledge. And now you are there to share it with others, to be like a communal grandparent, somebody who takes care and helps other people learn things. I love that sort of thing, but it's not something that's really imbued and diffuse throughout a lot of cultures today.
I'm curious to know how much you think seeking out, whether it be parenthood or opportunities to be a mentor, to invest in and celebrate the growth of younger people or people that are just younger than you, how much that can be a kind of antidote, if you will, to the sense of insecurity about our own aging.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. The way that I've been framing it actually for myself, I don't want to have kids, but I have 3 siblings who all do, 2 of them actively. I've got 2 nephews and a niece now. I consider it being an uncle, like uncle energy, bringing uncle energy to the world. And a lot of cultures have like the aunties and uncles and that sort of people I'm not directly blood related to, but they are significant adults in my life.
Yep.
I consider my role as an uncle for my siblings' kids, my nieces and nephews, but also for just young people in general, trying to be that significant positive adult figure in the lives of people younger than me is something that I take very seriously, increasingly so. In part because I see that as something that I am now in a position to do. I've accumulated enough experience. I'm far from done learning, I hope. But I've accumulated enough experience that I feel like that is an opportunity that I have to either be a negative influence, to be no influence, or to be a positive influence. And so making that choice, I feel like, is something that allows us to have some of that later in life energy, to take it, draw upon it, and use it for good, for the good of our community or society, whatever communities we happen to be a part of.
Yeah.
You know, you have a podcast called Let's Know Things. And the thing I really like about both you and TK is you get curious about things in a way that is non-judgmental. It's also in many ways non-instructive. Yeah, I never listened to Let's Know Things, and at the end of it, and Colin's like, and here's what you should do with that information. Like, that would actually ruin it. And so I think the same thing with the uncle energy, the father energy, the grandparent energy, whatever you want to call it. It's not about being didactic. And quite often we think that. We think that, oh, you know what? You know how I can be a great parental figure or adult figure? I can teach them. I can show them the only way that it is. But it seems to me, but what you're talking about, that uncle energy is not that at all.
No, it's not about shaping in the next generation. It's about enabling. In my mind, it's trying to provide the resources that they need. Sometimes that's informational resources. Sometimes it's just being the person there to encourage them. Half the emails that I answer from people who read my work or listen to my work is just people telling me about neat stuff that they're doing and they're feeling uncertain. And I just send them encouraging words. And then sometimes I'll hear from them years later. And that was like a really important email because nobody else in their life was just telling them, hey, that's cool.
Wow.
That's really great what you're doing. Congratulations. You should be very proud of that.
Wow.
Sometimes just doing that, I think, can be the most meaningful thing. But doing whatever you can, whatever that person in that position needs, somebody who could benefit from that, trying to figure out what that is and then trying to give it to them and just like lifting them up, putting them in the position to do whatever it is they're going to do based on what they believe, what they think is important.
To get back directly to McKenna's question here, I think there's something about insecurity that is sort of embedded in our culture now. And I think advertising does a great job of making us feel insecure in order to sell us products that we didn't even know we needed, but they have a solution to a problem I didn't even know I had. And for McKenna, it's like, oh no, I'm 22, I'm aging. And so of course, what products will help me not age? And of course, you can change your externalities as Colin alluded to, but that often doesn't make you not you. You are still you beneath those externalities. And so I wrote an essay recently, and this is good timing. It's called Store Brand Insecurity. There's a link to it we'll put in the show notes. I was driving one day, and this line just came to me. I was talking to myself, and that line is it's pretty simple, but it has to do with our own insecurities. And that line is, you care what other people think. You yearn for their acceptance because there's an underlying dissatisfaction in your own life. And so quite often, when I care about the judgment of others, when I care about the opinions or the beliefs of others, it's because there's something going on inside me. And there's this malaise of suffering, right? This dissatisfaction. But I would say that misery is the norm in our affirmation-based society. And so what's happening here that advertisers are showing us, here's how you get accepted. Here's how you become part of the group. It's whether you're using the right makeup, the right clothes, the right car, the right furniture, the right cleaning products. This is what will make you you. And in the essay, I basically posit a few things. Imagine if your neighbor tells you that she's disappointed because you don't own a private jet or a professional sports franchise. I mean, you just laugh that off. But that same person can make you feel really insecure, but they say, you know what? What's going on with those wrinkles right there?
Mm-hmm.
And it's like, oh, I feel something. I feel dissatisfied in me, and they're amplifying that dissatisfaction. I don't feel dissatisfied by not owning a private jet. It's not something I've ever even considered. And so if someone else is disappointed by that, guess what? It doesn't really matter to me, right?
I'm a little disappointed, frankly.
Damn. But I can explain.
What? Aren't you going to buy a hockey team? You guys are doing pretty well. Aren't you going to buy the Minimalist hockey team? No equipment. They are the hardest core hockey team out there.
So toward the end of the essay, I posit that there are basically two ways to increase your sense of security. First, you can enhance your externalities, right? You can get a better credit score. You can get more square footage. You can get a job title that is more impressive. You can get makeup and designer clothes and luxury cars and six-pack abs. And maybe after a few decades of accumulation, these accomplishments will hush your imaginary haters. The key word there being imaginary. Quite often we think we're being judged by a myriad of people, and yet we aren't actually at all. Those people that we think are judging us don't really care. Of course, the second way is to simply need less, affirmation, less veneration, less acceptance. Just like you don't need the jet or the sports team, you also don't need any amount of respect or worldly goods or wealth to make you. Of course, there's no formula that will instruct you how to need less. That's why I love the title of this book, How to Turn 39. It's not like there's an actual, I was joking during the private podcast intro, like, oh, I really wish I would have had this 5 years ago because I went straight from 38 to 40. But knowing that, like, it's not about how to turn 39, it's about understanding the process of aging. And so, Colin, when you're talking about how to here, you're really talking about what it takes to age responsibly.
Yeah, or to age in a way that makes sense for you and your specific needs and wants and values and everything else, because all of us want different things. All of us have different priorities. It's also, the title I thought was funny because it's something that we're all going to do anyway. So it's like giving instruction on something you can't help but do.
Yeah.
Like nobody is going to accidentally skip past 39 except Josh. Some people are remarkable. Josh is remarkable in different ways than most. But yeah, I mean, aging is something that we all do. It's something we all do in different ways. We all carry different baggage associated with aging. I think some people have a more healthy outlook just latently because of how they grew up than others. I think a lot of us have very disordered approaches to aging, just the way that we treat it or treat different aspects of it. I know I certainly did. And the past 5 years or so has been an adventure in figuring out, oh, hey, I have these assumptions. I have these biases. I have these, self-prejudices about what this means and what the implications are. Maybe I should sit with this and sort it out because this is the sort of investment that will pay dividends for the rest of my life.
Do you have any examples of some of those preconceived notions that have changed over the last 5 years?
Yeah, so a lot of us have certain ideas about where we should be at certain moments in our life. At 40, I need to have X, Y, and Z. I should definitely have a mortgage. I should definitely have X number of kids and a backyard and a trampoline. And these are cultural. They're very different from place to place wherever you go, but most places have a set template. You ask somebody from Sri Lanka, you ask somebody from Philadelphia, they will tell you the set constraints and templates that exist within their space, even if people tend to deviate from those. I had a lot of those. And even having deviated from that quite substantially earlier when I started traveling and got rid of all my stuff and had that little adventure, there's still the implication that, wasn't that fun? Now let's get back to the template. And even people who are very open-minded and who do not lock in on that sort of thing and try to enforce it consciously on other people, there are still certain expectations. You can get away with that kind of thing pretty easily and even be celebrated for it in your 20s. Get into your late 30s and people start to wonder what went wrong. Why don't you have the mortgage? Why don't you have the wife? Why don't you have the kids? Why don't you have that trampoline? where's the trampoline, Colin?
It almost becomes accusatory as well. What did you do wrong?
Exactly. And even people who have the best of intentions and who do not consider themselves to be strict adherents to the social mores and folkways that they grew up in might subconsciously, without even realizing it, try to enforce it upon others. And I found myself periodically doing the same. Like that's kind of how we knee-jerk make assumptions about other people. Like, here are my heuristics, my set of mental shortcuts and frameworks for how the world works. This person fits into this category, including their age. Why don't they have these other things that are supposed to go along with that category? And then without even knowing anything else about that person, I've made this whole array of assumptions about them. And without realizing it, those assumptions can then inform other things about how I interact with that person, treat that person, etc.
Wow. Okay, two things. One, I have a horror movie idea where Colin is in a Pleasantville type community where everyone's got the white picket fence, the so-called stereotypical American dream. And his neighbor knocks on his door and he's smiling and he goes, "Where's the trampoline, Colin?" And then the music goes, okay, coming soon to a theater near you. One thing I'd like to hear your thought on is Josh and I have talked before about one of the negative externalities of traditional education is that we internalize this deep sense of age segregation. We grow up in an environment where the fifth graders hang around the fifth graders, the seventh graders hang around the seventh graders, and it's really dramatic if you're in seventh grade and you're around fourth graders or vice versa. And we learn to think about who we are in terms of like, oh yeah, I'm 12, I'm 17, I'm 20. And it's usually not until we get to college or beyond college where we start to intermingle with other age groups in a way that's part of normal life, which is why for many people, those first 2 years after college are very depressing because you're working with people. You're 21, 22, you're working with people that are 26, 27, 35, and that feels really dramatic. How much of a role do you think that kind of mentality plays in our grappling with like the aging process?
Oh, I think it's huge. That age stratification throughout society, like you nailed it with school. School is training for work to a certain degree, but that stratification of age, like even look at the way well-meaning programs within school operate, where some people move forward, some people are held back. There's implications that if you're not doing X, Y, and Z on standardized tests by a certain age, you are more than or less than. And I understand why they do this because they want people to succeed within a certain matrix of assumptions about success. But I don't think that's necessarily the best way to handle things. I don't think it takes into consideration the broad spectrum of different ways of being and interacting and different types of maturity and different types of brain growth and development and everything else. And I think that does carry over. And like personally, this is something that I get into in the book as well. Cross-pollination between age groups is one of the most valuable things you can possibly have because it allows us to take knowledge that exists in older generations and pass it down before it disappears. Otherwise, we lose that knowledge. And this is something that exists within companies in a lot of cases, where you have a lot of workers who have been there for 20, 30 years. They all retire, and that knowledge of that industry, of their client list, of the way software works, or certain finicky knobs on the stove in the back in the kitchen work. And when you don't have that, you have to learn those things all over again. And that wastes a lot of time. It's unnecessary suffering that the next generation has to go through to learn the same things. The more we can pass on that knowledge, both from older people to younger people, but then also younger people to older people, to help them exist within the world that as it exists today, that has changed, that has progressed in many ways, that technology has changed, society has changed, the way things are connected has changed. One of my favorite things about the neighborhood that I live in Milwaukee is that there's a huge diversity in terms of people in general, just economic backgrounds and cultural classes and age. And you can walk down the street and there's toddlers, there's young professionals in their 20s and 30s, and then there's older people who have lived there forever. And I love the idea of having opportunities to bump into people of different age demographics and just have a conversation, just learn people's names, learn something about the way that they see the world. There's not a lot of opportunities to do that. And I love my neighborhood for having that. But part of why I love it and part of why I ended up renting there is that it's so rare. Like there's just not a lot of opportunities for that latently.
McKenna, I would love for you to check out that essay. It's called Store Brand Insecurity. And it has a lot to do with the way that we project ourselves onto the world, the dissatisfaction that we feel, and the unnecessary insecurities that we feel, like as a 22-year-old worrying about these skin routines. Nothing wrong with using the creams and everything else that Colin just said, although some of them I'm sure can be rather toxic. So that's a different conversation. But outside of that, it's really about understanding what's going on in here and how is that influenced by these external forces. And then also, how do we transcend that? Alabama, before we get back to our callers, what time is it?
You know what time it is. It's time for the lightning round, where we answer the Patreon community chat's question of the week.
Yes, indeed. Now, during the lightning round, we each have 60 seconds to answer your question with a short, shareable, minimal maxim. You can find this episode's maxims in the show notes at theminimalists.com/podcast, and every minimal maxim ever at minimalmaxims.com. We'll also deliver our weekly show notes directly to your inbox, including 5 new maxims every Monday for free if you sign up for our free email newsletter at theminimalists.email. We'll never send you spam or junk or advertisements, but we will start your week off with a dose of simplicity. Alabama, what is the question of the week this week?
Would your 15-year-old self be impressed by you today?
This one is a doozy because it really made me think, and I want to hear your answers, but I want to turn to our audience first because we had some patrons give some interesting answers. Some people said, yes, my 15-year-old self would be impressed. Other people said, no, my 15-year-old self wouldn't be impressed. Alabama, take it away.
This one comes from Cordelia. 15-year-old me would be relieved so many of our dreams were realized, that I raised a family with a great life partner and remained a good mix of adventurous, rebellious, and responsible while dealing with adulthood. Young me would also love that I ride a motorbike and still go to lots of live music gigs, but would definitely kick my butt for not picking up my own guitar for the last couple of years.
Okay, so there are pieces there where it's like, oh, my 15-year-old self would be like, hey, why didn't you stick with the guitar? Now, sometimes it might be like, I didn't really like the guitar anymore. Other times like, well, life kind of got in the way. And you know what was more important than that? The trampoline, obviously, right? And so I had to decide between the two. Now, we also had some folks say, no, my 15-year-old self would not be impressed. Velanie said this.
My automatic answer was no, my 15-year-old self wouldn't be impressed. But after taking a day to think deeply about this, I realized my initial answer was cluttered with difficulties in my past that I'm still working on in therapy. I have a kind and loving husband, an amazing daughter, all debts paid, and a good, stable job. I'm doing just fine. She would be impressed that I found the strength and courage to escape a hard life and that I'm happy now.
Reminds me of, we were doing one of those more about less segments on the private podcast. We were reading some quotes, the 5 most popular quotes from the Waking Up app, Sam Harris's Waking Up. And one of them was from Sam Harris. And Sam said that there are at least 1 billion people on Earth who would be willing to trade their life for your life today. And it creates this perspective like, oh yeah, I know I've got pains. I know I have misery. I know I have literal aches and pains as I age, right? But there are over 1 billion people who would love to be in my situation, even with all of those pains today.
Yeah. I wake up every day trying to remind myself of those sorts of things. And partially that's because I have to take a pill now for hypothyroidism, something that's come to me with age. But yeah, I mean, I think that type of perspective helps. And honestly, looking back, my 15-year-old self probably wouldn't initially understand the way that I do things now. But I do think that once I explained to him that we're playing a different game now, you know, and we're actually doing okay according to the rules of this new game, that he would probably get it. He'd be a little disappointed at first that we're not only playing games all day, every day, because that was a long-held ambition.
And you know, there is a piece of your life that continues to change. I remember when I first was introduced to your work back in 2009.
We are so old.
You were so young at the time. I was like
12 years old.
I think you were 24 when I was first introduced to your work. And what I was really impressed by wasn't the details necessarily, but I was impressed that you were able to shun the societal and cultural expectations that I had heaped onto myself. I had adorned myself with all of the cultural expectations. And if I just get another car, I just get more square footage. If I just get better suits and I get better possessions, then I will be a better version of me. And that was really what consumerism is. Consumerism is the ideology that buying more things will make me better.
Mm-hmm.
And man, I tried it out and it wasn't working. And then here comes this guy and he did this. There was this interview. I saw someone tweet and he said he owned 51 things and everything he owned fit in his backpack. And at the time, Colin, you were a full-time traveler. Full-time traveler. It's really important where the hyphen goes there.
Full-time traveler.
You know, the early 19th century is really lovely if you get the chance to visit.
How to turn 139. So what I learned there is like, oh, I don't want to live his life. But he was able to, by simplifying his life, embracing this thing called minimalism, Colin Wright was able to do what he wanted to do with his life. And I'm currently unable to do what I want to do with my life, which at the time was just write fiction, because I have all of these other obligations that have been handed to me by my culture. Now, to be fair, they weren't just handed to me by my culture. I picked them up and I held on to those expectations. But Colin showed me that, you know what, you can actually set those down. But since then, you used to travel every 4 months. You went to a new country. All of your readers at your website, Exile Lifestyle, they would vote where you were going to go next. And for me, I thought this was going to just last in perpetuity. But that's not really how aging works. Sometimes there are chapters and we let go of something. We can always pick it back up. But can you talk about how your life has changed, even though you were living the way you wanted to live before? Now you're living the way you want to live now. But that has, of course, brought some change into your life.
Yeah, absolutely. Part of the reason I finally wrote this book is that I realized over the past handful of years, I tried to write like 3 different books, and I got maybe 2/3 of the way through one of them about creative seasonality, about how our desire to make things, we want to make different things, we are good at making different things, we are driven to make different things throughout our lives. That was one of the books I tried to write. And I realized that was actually part of this larger concept of aging and life seasonality. And the idea that as you grow and as you change and as you iterate, as you evolve into different versions of yourself, when you shrug off certain expectations, certain ways of doing things, certain norms, certain rituals, certain ideas about yourself, certain preferences, those are not completely left by the wayside. It can be, instead of like a completely monodirectional transition, it can instead be seasonal, where you go through rotations and you have periods of your life where one thing is important or the most important thing in your life, and then you move on, and then there's another thing that takes that prime position. You can have different preferences, ways of living, different everything in these different transitional seasons. And that's something that happens whether we want it to or not. But I think that embracing that makes it easier to step into those new shoes, to get out of your rain boots and move into your warm slippers, and then to take those off and put on, I don't know, probably flip-flops, whatever people wear when it's hot. I try to avoid hot places. You can move between these things, and they are all versions of you. And they're all versions of you, so that's good. But it's also okay to move because you know there's another season coming. And so you can adopt something that might initially seem uncomfortable and something that goes against everything that you care about and believe in, but which something in you tells you that you should probably check out. And for me, moving on from that stage of my life where I was moving, the model mostly was every 3 or 4 months, moving to a new country, people voting on it. I riffed on that model quite a bit by the end of the 7 or 8 years that I was doing that full time, in part because it was so familiar. It sounds very adventurous and still going to a new place. I love it. I love the thrill of it, the feeling. You feel very alive. All of your senses turn on because everything is so fresh and new. But it also became a little bit rote I knew what I was doing. It was not as surprising and shocking and valuable as it would have been when I first started doing it. And what was utterly terrifying to me was the idea of receiving mail every day and shopping for furniture. Because like that was something that I had not done since I was 24. And so when I was going into my late 30s, thinking, I don't even know what I would buy. I go into places and I rent furnished places in these different countries I go to. I've intentionally shrugged off preferences so I can fit into any space I happen to enter. I have been Jell-O for so long, I don't know what shape I would take if I was forced to solidify and make decisions like that on my own. I didn't know who I was in that context. And part of me too, living that way for so long, going to places where I don't know what's happening, I rely a lot on other people, watching people trying to figure out how things happen, how society works, people very kindly taking me under their wing to explain all the stupid choices and actions that I'm taking. You don't have a lot of privacy. And you are making all of your mistakes in public. And there's a lot of vulnerability that comes with that. And with enough vulnerability of any kind, like I feel this a little bit every time I put out a newsletter, much less going to a place and showing people exactly how ignorant I am every single day. You can get a bit of a hangover from that, a vulnerability hangover where it's just, it wears at you and it's exhausting. And for me, within that context, a vacation was going to a place that I controlled where I could close the door and just like, having privacy, knowing how everything functioned around me and having that friction-free experience, that felt like luxury. And I so seldom had it. And every time I did, I thought, man, if I ever do this for too long, I'm just going to keep doing this. That it just felt so wonderful. And so I wanted to face that. I wanted to face it in part because it seemed like a way to recharge my battery after doing that for so long. Part of it terrified me, but then I also wanted to make sure that I proved to myself that sitting still and closing the door and allowing myself to recover from that vulnerability hangover, I could, within that space, still push myself beyond that. I could move away from the vacation aspect of it and still challenge myself. I wanted to prove that to myself. Otherwise, I would probably never do the things that I needed to do to recharge that battery out of fear.
I remember when you stopped traveling, you moved to Wichita, and then I think for a whole year, maybe.
Yeah, nearly a year.
Yeah.
11 months. They allow you to do an 11-month lease in Kansas.
Okay. So you were there, and then you ended up in Memphis, and now you're in Milwaukee. And I think that above all, your 15-year-old self would not have expected any of this. You writing a book about going to India and then Iceland and then going to every state in the continental United States, or you walking away from your design studio business so that you could become this full-time traveler. But then also the full-time traveler walking away from full-time travel, being open to any of that, because as soon as it begins to feel obligatory, that's when it becomes a bit of a prison. And so I think your 15-year-old self would be really impressed by everything that has transpired, but wouldn't have expected any of it. TK, what about you? In terms of your 15-year-old self, back to the question of the week.
Wait. His 15-year-old self would be impressed by the number of books. Because this is the only man who, if he dies today, he could look God in the eyes and say, I gave you more books than you gave me years.
You know, and that kid did love books too. 15-year-old self started working at a bookstore at 14 just for the discount on the books. So yeah, that kid would be impressed by that.
What about you, TK? Would your 15-year-old self be impressed by you today? You got something pithy for me?
Yeah, my pithy quote is, my current idea of the good life is my childhood idea of the bad life. My gosh, the other day my wife says to me, hey, we don't have any plans for Friday night, do we? And I go, no, we don't. And we both say at the same time, yay! I'm trying to imagine me talking to my 15-year-old self and saying, hey there, little buddy, when you get to be my age, you're going to take lots of walks by yourself. You're going to go to a daily mass. Your concept of a Saturday night will be doing nothing. And because of a little intestinal obstruction that you'll encounter later on, you're going to eat a fiber-free diet. It's great up here. I mean, he'd probably cry and say, kill me now. But, you know, we have a lot of great books on like how to achieve your childhood dreams, but I think we need more on how to unshackle yourself from your childhood dreams. Part of the glorification of youth that Colin talks about is the way we deify the first few dreams we had as children. And oftentimes those dreams are immature, unpolished, ambiguous expressions of a deeper desire that we simply have not lived long enough to quite figure out. And when you get to be this age, you kind of have a more refined concept of what it is you really want. And so now I'm old enough to realize that I shouldn't fear being impressive in the future to the current guy that I am. I should fear still having the same level of consciousness and actually holding my future self accountable to the unrefined ideas I have today.
I think there's also something about those shackles of the past that really get in the way of the present moment. Those immature dreams that you're talking about, quite often, they're dreams that, because we feel unappreciated in some way, at least in my own case, it was like, if I'm successful enough in the corporate world, then maybe people will eventually like me, right? And then, of course, yeah, people already liked me, or they didn't like me, or whatever, but is that what I really want to be liked for? Is my car, or for how nice my house is? Is that them liking me, or is it liking the things that I have accumulated, right? And so, Colin, when I think about aging, you actually have a whole chapter in your new book about accomplishments. I think part of the aging clutter has to do with accomplishment clutter in a way.
Yeah. Well, and riffing on something that TK just said too, a lot of the accomplishments that we consider to be valid, I think, are not necessarily ours, or they're not necessarily the best version of what we could be thinking about in terms of goals. They're inherited. Like they're handed down to us. In a lot of cases, we're handed a slab of marble that over time, over the course of our lives, we have to chisel into something that looks more like us. And over time, they become more specific. And then in some cases, we do a hard right or a hard left, and we deviate from something that we thought was correct. But then we learn something new about the world, or about ourselves, about other people, that then caused us to pivot from that a bit. Part of living, though, and part of not just getting older, but growing older, I think, in my estimation at least, is refining that and refining that and refining that, so that we spend more of our time, energy, and resources on the right things. The core precept of minimalism, the idea of spending things appropriately on what's most valuable. And a key component of that is figuring out what's valuable. And as we get older, we are able to say with more confidence and specificity what that is. We'll become less confident about a lot of stuff because we'll have more gray areas. Things will seem less black and white. We won't be able to say as definitively so many things. But for me, at least, I've never felt more simultaneously confident and completely incompetent in my entire life. But I think that's where we should be. Like if you're going through and challenging things and making those difficult little chisels onto the slab of marble, that's something that you're going to feel very tenuous about at times and very uncomfortable, like you have unstable footing. But at the same time, if you do periodically take a step back and look at what you're doing, the things that you've accomplished, the things that you want to accomplish, the direction that you're going, it will look more and more like you as you grow older.
I agree that there is sort of no, it sounds to me like what you're saying, at least, is there's no one right way to age.
Absolutely not. Yeah.
But if there is a wrong way to age, it's to continue to follow the precepts of your culture if it's not what you want, if it's not what is important to you. That is sort of the opposite of minimalism, spending all of your resources, be it your money, your time, your energy, your attention on the things that are important to everyone else but not important to you. That sounds like a recipe for misery.
Yeah, it really does. And then the more you accomplish, the more you'll feel weird about it because it doesn't seem to be getting you what you were promised.
That's right. You'll get everything you ever wanted and then find out, oh, that's not what I actually wanted. All right, y'all, we're just getting started. We have a swarm of callers to talk to. But first, real quick for right here, right now, here's one thing that's going on in the life of the Minimalists. It's time for the Minimalists annual performance review. This is your chance to let us know how much you enjoy the show. Most podcasts and YouTube channels ask their audience to click, rate, review, subscribe, ring the notification bell, etc., on every single episode. Not us. We don't want to clutter your listening experience. So once a year on my birthday, that's right, my birthday is next week, y'all. I'm learning how to turn 39. Again.
You got a lot of books to catch up on, man.
So it's my birthday, and I'd like to ask you for a birthday gift. Would you be willing to leave a 5-star review on Apple Podcasts or Spotify as a birthday gift to me? We ask for this once a year. And I'd really, really appreciate that gift. I will take any time in the next month, if you leave a review, I will take the time to read that and say thank you for giving me that birthday gift. Head on over to Apple Podcasts or Spotify to rate this podcast today. And don't worry, I'm not going to ask you again next week, but I would really appreciate the birthday gift. I'm turning 43, by the way, y'all.
I can see the maturity by you using that opportunity for the podcast rather than your OnlyFans account. You're really growing up, dude.
And you don't look a day over 42.
I remember when our daughter Ella was really young and my birthday was coming up, and I said, how old am I turning? I think she was maybe 4 or 5 at the time, and she goes, 81? I was like, I'm 36. All right, Malaban, we got a bunch more to talk about, but first, what else you got for us?
Here's a minimalist insight from one of our listeners.
Hi, my name's Jules from New England, and I have a listener tip that I stumbled across. So one day I was scrolling and I found this blog post from some blogger lady about how she did a downsizing challenge, but it wasn't quite a 30-day challenge and it definitely wasn't a packing party. So her challenge was to get rid of 100 items in 1 hour. And at first, I kind of went through the motions. Initially, I was like, that's so many items. And then I was like, that's no items. And so I just didn't really know how to feel about it. So I just did it. And the first 40 minutes of it went so quickly and I got rid of so many things. But then the last 30 items, it was a struggle to find things. And so some of my items were like old spices or expired medicine or stuff that I needed to throw out. So I don't know if that really counts, but I'm going to count it. And then I found out that when the hour was up, I had finished with 104 items that I had gotten rid of. And I still felt like I could go through my home and find little things and get rid of them as I went through the rest of my day. So it wasn't quite the whole 30 days, which I find that I try it and still around day 6 or day 7, I've just completely given up. And it wasn't the packing party, which is a little too extreme for me. And so I found that this was a good happy medium that kind of got my gears turning and got me to get rid of some stuff and purge that felt good, but not too overwhelming, and still tapped into that competitive spirit with the timing aspect. So maybe give it a try, see if it, sparks something. And thank you for all you do, minimalists.
Jules, that is so cute. It's like the 30-day minimalism game on steroids. Thank you for your clutter-free comment, Jules. For anyone else who has a listener tip or insight about this episode or any other episode, you can leave a comment on Patreon or YouTube, or better yet, send a voice memo to podcast@theminimalists.com so we can feature your voice on the show. All right, that is the first 39% of episode 448. See what I did there, Colin Wright? The first 39% of episode 448. We'll see you on Patreon for the full Maximal edition with Colin Wright, which includes a bunch of answers to a bunch more questions. We answer questions like, how can I form meaningful relationships if I am an extreme introvert and other people often exhaust me? Also, I'm 22 years old and I feel behind compared to my peers. Is this a universal experience, or is it something that will pass as I learn more about myself? And how do I identify and let go of toxic relationships as I grow older? Plus, we've got a million more questions and simple living segments over on the Minimalists private podcast. We also have an outstanding home tour for one of our listeners this week on Patreon. Just visit patreon.com/theminimalists or click the link down in the description to subscribe and get your personal link so that our weekly Maximal episodes play in your favorite podcast app. You'll also gain access to all of our podcast archives, all the way back to episode 001. By the way, Patreon is now offering free trials, so if you'd like to test drive our private podcast, you can join for 7 days for free. Big thanks to our guest today, Colin Wright. His new book is called How to Turn 39, Thoughts About Aging for People of All Ages. You can also find his podcast and all of his other work, his newsletter as well, which I subscribe to over at colin.io. We'll put a link to that in the show notes. And that is our minimal episode for today. If you leave here with just one message, let it be this. love people, and use things. Because the opposite never works. Thanks for listening, y'all.
We'll see you next time.
Peace.
Every little thing you think that you need. Every little thing you think that you need. Every little thing that's just feeding your greed. Oh, I bet that you'd be fine without it.